Wow, as Don points out, there's a lot of work to do. But in the face of that, I mean, we have this fantastic turnout here, so and that's great. It's obviously this is a real testament to the organizers. Thanks again to the organizers for the I think it's also a testament to the possibility of a more democratic media system. To see the interests that we have here today, right, really begins to give some ground to build upon to face these things. So, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. As was pointed out, when I was first contacted about being on this panel, Sun TV was at the height of its efforts to get its all-news channel set up as a primary service on cable and satellite. And there was a lot of concern that we'd soon have something like a Fox News North sort of blaring into our living rooms. But since then, as Steve has mentioned, right, things have changed. The station is still coming, but the company withdrew its request for priority service and now seems destined to join everybody else in jostling for position in the discretionary channel lineup. But it seems that the company did not retreat lightly, and it was only after a concerted campaign against their plans that they pulled back. Now this then, again, as Steve mentioned, I think signals really a bit of a victory for the forces of reform. So we can see some positive movement here. Certainly in a democratic media system, we would not want to deny them a spot in the lineup, but by the same token, they shouldn't be allowed to kind of elbow their way to the front of the line either, so to speak. So not to sort of get carried away on this, but I think this event does strike up a bit of an optimistic note in the grand scheme of media reform in Canada. And this is important because optimistic notes can be few and far between in this venue. And I think this event signals that it's important to remember that progressive outcomes are in fact possible. That in the past, there have been a number of victories, and that in what we are now seeing as very turbulent times, with renewed effort, there can in fact be more. So with this in mind, for the next few minutes, I want to strike an optimistic note, if I can, right? And conduct a short review of the history of broadcast regulation with an eye to the lessons that it might have for us in today's climate. Now, after years of jaded experience, watching all the exponential growth of corporate media power, it is sometimes hard for me to be optimistic about media regulation. So please bear with me, and if I seem to slip into cynicism once in a while, that's the way history is. But today, of course, we continue to have tremendous change in the structure and operation of our media. Just when you think there could be no more concentration of ownership, along comes Shaw to buy up CanWest television assets, and Bell basically to buy back CTV Globe Media. And at the same time, there continues to be ongoing regulatory change, as well as both government and CRTC react to these changes in corporate structure, and the CRTC, in all good faith, to some extent, does struggle to find ways to maintain broad public objectives in the face of these changes. Now, in this regard, on the regulatory front, the CRTC has just announced a review of recent industry consolidation, and in the face of that review, the Department of Heritage has announced a similar exercise in preparation for the CRTC review. And at the same time, the CRTC has continued to make noises about a possible merger of the Telecommunication and Broadcasting Acts. So here's something that these upcoming inquiries could well help sort of pave the way for, something we have to watch, right? And it's, of course, times such as these that present then both opportunity and dangers for media reform. This is a very turbulent time. And I think here's where we might look to the past to help discern what opportunities this situation might present for us. Right? So if we're looking at a change in legislation coming up, I think it's good to remember the very progressive legislative changes that were brought in by the 1991 Broadcasting Act, right? The act that actually governs the field today. And it was in the 1991 Act that the cultural objectives of broadcasting were more fully elaborated over previous legislation, where community broadcasting was recognized as a key element of the system alongside the private and public parts or elements. It was also where the importance of Aboriginal broadcasting was acknowledged, and a comprehensive definition of the range of programming that should be available within the system was also elaborated there. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that the 1991 Broadcasting Act marked a clear step forward in progressive media legislation. And it did so in what were difficult political and economic times as well. You remember, Brian Mulroney had just finalized a free trade agreement with the US a few years earlier, And following the stock market crash of 1987, the world had slipped into a deep recession in 1990 and 91. Times were tough then, as they are now, yet the most progressive broadcasting regulation in history was actually passed by Parliament then. But one thing to remember about the inclusion of these things in this legislation is that they did not just appear on the legislative agenda out of nowhere. Right? In fact, they were the product of decades of work, right? Decades of work by activists setting up media outlets, decades of planting ideas in the minds of regulators and legislators, just as the move to the right now is the product of decades of work, right? So too are progressive things, right? Also decades of hammering at regulation to get space in the broadcasting field. These things are not overnight successes. Since the inclusion of these ideas in the Broadcasting Act, there has also been progress in these areas. In terms of radio broadcasting, there's been considerable development in terms of community and campus radio stations, right? In the field of Aboriginal broadcasting, APTN is now well established, as are more broadly Aboriginal rights in the field. And with community television, the community television policy of 2002, community TV did take a step toward independence from cable companies. Certainly, things have not progressed as far as we may have liked in these areas. Right? Both community and Aboriginal broadcasters remain woefully underfunded. The latest community TV policy leaves much to be desired, but even that, despite its disappointments, I think offers the hope of cracks in the existing regime, as the dissenting opinion that came down with that policy illustrates. Right? So the point is that although very slow, there have been progressive changes in the system, and ground for future change has been developed. The trick, I think, here is to build, or I dare say, capitalize, right, on that ground. Right? So what about today? Where are we now? What lessons does this history hold for the particular challenges and opportunities that are presenting themselves at the moment? Well, most recently, we've seen this round of concentration that's setting the stage for this upcoming hearing on consolidation. The main feature of this consolidation has, of course, been vertical integration. That is, between production and distribution, as both Bell and Shaw try to exploit economies of scale, not only across the different TV channels they own, but also across different distribution platforms, such as television, cell phones, and iPads. Right? As one of Shaw's chief executives was quoted in the Globe and Mail last week, he said, "No matter what device you have in your hand, you will see Glee," which is not a bad show. Right? You'll see House. Right? We don't want to lose audiences to Hulu or Netflix. Of course, as that quote illustrates, they're not largely concerned about ensuring that we have access to a broad range of new and innovative Canadian content, right? No, actually, rather they want to be sure that they can direct and develop their markets for American programming that is the mainstay of their business. But I think in the face of both recent consolidations and the broad history of media regulation, there are two things to think about in this environment, two concurrent courses of action for reform efforts. The first would be to ensure that there's open access to these new platforms. Right? Just as access to cable and satellite distribution systems have been key sites of struggle in the past, right? So too access to new mobile platforms will also be a site of struggle. Be these platforms smartphones, iPads, or maybe Kindles on steroids, right? Whatever there needs to be open access to these devices by a diverse group of producers. Hence, I think such access needs to be enunciated in any new regulation, and this should be at the top of the list, right? Be it couched in terms of net neutrality or perhaps more traditional language. Secondly, learning from the past, we also need to think about how a diverse set of producers can get financing for their work. Perhaps most importantly, a diverse set of producers needs to have access to existing production funds, right? As it exists now, monies earmarked for production, such as those flowing from public benefits packages, are increasingly moving toward these large, vertically integrated companies. So I'd argue then, there are two key general points to bring forward into this upcoming round of public hearings over consolidation. That is access and funding, right? And just to add another one to the mix, as we know, it often takes years for good ideas to find their way into regulation. And one idea that was brought forward at the community channel hearings that really seemed to finally find some traction among different people and groups was the idea of establishing some form of not-for-profit independent media centers across the country. Establishing such centers would be one way to crystallize the other two issues around a specific and tangible project, and establishing some kind of fund that would help to get such centers both established and help them in their operation would go a long way, I should say, to increasing the diversity of media in the system. And you're very lucky in Vancouver to have that W2 Center downtown, the old Woodward Center, right? And that's one of the most premier and progressive centers in the country. So very lucky for you here. Right? So, just as big corporations are now realizing, to a large degree, it no longer makes sense to talk about content for simply radio, television, or the net. Content is converging, and the range of devices with which have access to it are also multiplying. Hence, we also need, to meet with that, we need a range of public media that can participate in developing content for these platforms. And certainly, community media centers would offer some of those kinds of opportunities. So in short now, I think it's, although there are clouds on the horizon, there often are, right? But that's the reason for us to there are many of us here to redouble our efforts to media reform and carry the idea forward. Thank you very much.